What's up guys, it's Sasha here, and today I'm going to bring you something a little bit different. This is the Not Mac. This was a project I originally made for school, but I liked it so much that I decided to make a video about it and tell you guys about it because, well, it's pretty cool. So if you're unaware, there's a huge community of people online who installed Mac OS on unsupported hardware, and a lot of the time they put those builds that they put the Mac OS on into the cases of old Macs like Power Mac G3s, G4s, and G5s, and Mac Pro cases that they modify. This would not just make them Hackintosh machines, but also make them case-modded machines. Now, while I didn't bother trying to make this a Hackintosh, I did make this into a case mod, as you can obviously tell just by this, and I built it into the case of a 2008 Mac Pro that I got online empty for like 40 bucks. Inside, the machine is rocking an Intel Xeon E5450, which is actually an interesting story in and of itself, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. It also has 4GB of DDR3 RAM, an NVIDIA GTX 660 Ti, and a 120GB PNY SSD, all plugged into a Gigabyte PA-P43 ES3G LJ775 motherboard, which is powered by an EVGA 500W BQ power supply. Excluding the power supply, which is bought completely new, these are all parts from many years ago, and yet they still hold up today as evidenced by the Geekbench scores and gameplay footage that I'll show you later on. Now before we get started, I just want to stress that later on you might see me using a different motherboard than the one I just mentioned here, and that's because that was a different motherboard. Originally I intended to use a Dell Inspiron 560 motherboard, which was a standard form factor micro ATX motherboard, but it died about a week after I finished the build and ran all the benchmarks, so I had to replace it and I got the one that I have here. Now, first let's talk about preparing the actual case for building. Now, if it wasn't already blatantly obvious, Apple doesn't use standard motherboards for their computers. They actually custom design motherboards to fit into their computers, and they design the cases around those custom built motherboards. If you're going to do a Mac Pro case mod, or any sort of Apple case mod, you're going to have to physically modify the case, which includes cutting and drilling and whatever else you need in order to prepare it for your build and your parts. In order to make my parts work with this specific case, I bought parts from a site called the Laser Hive. They're a company based out of the United Kingdom, began by a guy named David Chugg, who is a very nice guy and pleasant to do business with. He sells conversion kits for various Macs, including the Power Mac G3, G4, G4 Cube, G5, and Mac Pro, but as far as I understand, the G5 and Mac Pro conversion kits are what make him the most profit. In my first order from the Laser Hive, I ordered the front panel and case back conversion kits. It took them a little bit to arrive, but after they did, I could finally begin cutting. The entire Mac Pro is made out of anodized aluminum, so I couldn't just use scissors or a knife. I mean, technically I could, but that would be stupid and pointless. Pulling out my trusty Dremel 3000, I decided to do the front panel first, seeing as how it was the smallest piece of the puzzle thus far. I dragged everything outside of my house and started setting up. The first step was to take the template that was included in the box and line it up with the original panel. I then used a Sharpie to mark out the specific parts that were required to cut. I put a Ziploc bag under the areas I was cutting to catch the aluminum filings, but in hindsight I don't think that helped a lot, as a lot of the stuff went under or past the bag, and I think I ended up cutting through the bag on several occasions, making a bigger mess than I intended. Once I cut out the first part, it just fell through the hole and I had the first part of the project done. Next was the power button. The first step was to remove the power button itself. I didn't get this part on camera, but it required pulling out a small metal fixture within the molding for the power button, and then knocking on the actual power button with a metal screwdriver in order to break the weld that had been applied to keep it stuck to the front of the case. After that was done, I needed to enlarge the hole for my new power button, so I did that, and after a while, I was able to stick the power button that was included in the kit into the hole that I made. After that, I tried to stick in the actual USB ports, but I noticed that for some reason they just wouldn't fit. Then I realized I was stupid and I saw that there were a few motherboard standoffs in the way of the fit, so I took to taking those out. It took some time, but after fitting it in, I could fasten the screws and washers, and it finally fit with a reliable hold. I had the first part of the project done, and it looked almost Apple official. While I was waiting for my Dremel parts to come in, I decided to put together the parts to see if they would post. I grabbed the old motherboard, as this part of the video was filmed before the motherboard broke and I got the new one. I grabbed my CPU and put it into the socket. When it comes to inserting CPUs into their respective sockets, there's really only one correct way to do it, so all you really need to do is just drop in the CPU with the arrow pointed the right way, and pull down the retention arm, and it should work just fine. Remember how in the beginning of this video I mentioned that the CPU itself was a really interesting story? Well, here's that story. The LGA 775 platform was the consumer version of the LGA 775 platform, which was what your standard Core 2 quads, Core 2 duos, and Pentium CPUs of that era were released on. The business and server side of that was called LGA 771. Now, these were very, very similar to each other, and in order to make them cross-compatible, well, really it was more make LGA 771 compatible with LGA 775. At some point, it was discovered that all you really have to do is drill a couple, or cut a couple inserts into the CPU and weld a couple of the pins, and you could use a server CPU on a consumer-grade motherboard, and it should work without any issues. That's what this Xeon CPU is. Now, this modification does end up being permanent. However, if you don't want to make it permanent, you can buy little stickers, and all you have to do is just put them onto the thing, but I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to work, and I'm not going to bother because I have everything I need right here in this permanently modified one. I grabbed my RAM and inserted it into the slot, and did the same with the GPU. The power supply was actually a learning experience for me, as it was the first time I'd ever dealt with a power supply for a computer. In fact, this entire part of the project was a huge learning experience for me, as I had never actually put together pieces of a computer like this, ages-old parts or not. It took me several tries before I finally realized that the connector's pins only go one way, and after a near heart attack experience where I thought for a second that the Dell motherboard that I had a proprietary power supply, because OEM manufacturers love to do that, I got the connector to fit and my fears subsided. I then plugged in the power to the GPU on top, plugging in the cables into their respective ports, and that was that. Then I plugged the entire thing in, and after fussing with the connectors on the power button and the respective connectors on the motherboard, I finally got it to boot, and I even got out my Apple Cinema display with the adapter just to test it, for the aesthetic. To my excitement, it posted without a doubt. It didn't even need a BIOS update to work with the Xeon, which really relieved me as it saved me a lot of time. Next was the back side of the case. This was actually the longest part of the build for me, as this took at least several weeks to complete due to a combination of the tightness of my weekly schedule, the availability of garage space, and my dad to supervise and help out. The first step was to cut out the back I/O panel. This took me a while and was really hard to do, seeing as how the Dremel cutting wheels kept shattering and wearing down. I swear to God, we must have went through at least 40 of them before we finished the entire back panel. After the back panel were the PCIe slot protectors. I cut the square, and after I was done, I wiggled the metal back and forth until it broke off the case. There were also some more welds that we needed to break, so we cut that off along with the rivets that were holding the weld in place. Cutting the rivets was actually kind of exciting, as the contact with the Dremel caused sparks to fly out, which was a first for me, as that never happened to me before in any project that I've done. While I was looking up what we had to do next in the guide, my dad cut out a little bit more of the case. First we cut a little bit under where the back I/O was, and then we cut just under where the latch is for holding the side door of the case. Then we got to work on where the power supply would go. Now we got to putting the back panel sheet onto the case. This was actually a little challenging, not because the parts were so small, but because the screws weren't magnetic, causing them to fly all over the place. I got it to stay, but it took a lot of work. The next step was taking out the tray inside the case because the PCIe shield wouldn't fit without it. The shield was too big to fit under the hole we made, so we had to physically remove the obstacle, which was the tray. This was probably the hardest part of the project, and here's why. The tray is directly wrapped under this metal bar that controls the locking mechanism for the side door. Taking it off would have required taking out the mechanism, but that would leave us without a side door. I decided to go full caveman and just straight up cut off the tray from the supports, because that was the only viable solution in my head, and I didn't feel like having a doorless house. After that and about 10 Dremel cutting wheels, not only did we make enough room for the PCIe shield, but that also gave us access to the full space of the case, which will be good if we really need it. Oh, while doing this, I also ended up bending and almost breaking a screwdriver in 2 different locations, so yeah, that's kinda cool. Next was putting it all together. I got the PCIe protector screwed on and began work on the power supply. The screwing of the power supply was actually sort of challenging, as the holes that were drilled on the metal sheet we screwed onto the case were bigger than the actual mesh design on the case, and it wouldn't let me mount the power supply with the screws. So to compensate, I decided to just drill through the mesh and make them fit forcefully. After that, there seemed to be no further issues and the power supply fit just fine. Next was the motherboard tray, which was also purchased from the Laser Hive. There were a bunch of things I had to do, like making it fit on top of the standoffs. I actually had to cut off most of the rest of the standoffs in order to make the motherboard tray fit in the case, but once that was done, it fit in without a problem. I grabbed my SSD, which was previously used in my main rig. I screwed it onto the part of the tray allocated to the drives, and after some trouble accidentally breaking one of the nylon screws that came with the set, I got it to fit. The part that holds the 2.5-inch drives was too close to the motherboard to fit, and every time I tried screwing in the board it would bend at odd angles that made me really uncomfortable and worried about it breaking, so to help with that, I grabbed some motherboard standoffs from a set of computer case screws that I purchased, and I screwed them into the holes on the tray. Next was a case fan. I grabbed the original case fan from the Mac Pro, as it had a seemingly standard 4-pin connector, and I thought it would be good Samaritanly of me to reuse it. I had the same issues with mounting the case fan that I did with the power supply mount. I took to re-drilling some of the holes to make it fit, and it finally did. Also, when I ordered the back plate from the laser hive, I also ordered a fan mesh to act as a filter of sorts between the exhaust fan and the outside. After putting the fan on top of that, I got it to fit. It was at that point when I realized I was an idiot and screwed on the SSD the wrong way, so I unscrewed the motherboard and the tray piece, flipped it around, and put it back together, and things seemed to be fine from there. I grabbed the SATA cable I was going to use for the build, but then I realized I couldn't use it because the connector was bent at 90 degrees. So I salvaged its SATA cable from an old non-working Optiplex 320 that I had under my desk, and it fit perfectly and it works just fine. Next was dealing with the cooler. The cooler I bought, the Evercool whatever this is a bunch of crap. It repeatedly broke when I was trying to get it to fit, so I just said screw it and left it half done, which gave me a couple problems down the line. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I plugged in the fan from the heatsink to the motherboard and socketed my RAM, and then I started plugging in all the connectors and all the other components. And finally, after about a month of hard work, I could finally see the fruits of my labor. I turned it on, and with a little pit stop, it booted straight into my Windows 10 installation that I still had on the SSD, which was a surprise to me because I didn't expect it to work at all. I got to work reinstalling Windows 10, and after a few days of installing updates, it worked, but I had this odd issue where it would attempt to boot, and after 10 seconds it would just shut itself down. It took me a few days to realize, but it was actually the fault of the CPU cooler, and because I half-assed the mounting job, it would overheat and shut itself down to avoid burning out the CPU. I later bought a better CPU cooler, and it worked perfectly fine, and as an added bonus, it had these cool pulsating blue LED lights, which was pretty cool. That permanently solved that issue. The first thing I did on the computer after installing Steam, Chrome, and BLC and all the other important things was run Geekbench. Stating again, these were all recorded before the motherboard died, but the results with the new motherboard are still the same. Here are the scores for the CPU benchmarks with a single core score of 1954 and a multi-core score of 5328. Compare that to my main rig with an i7 3770K, 32GB of RAM, and a GTX 1050, which has scores of 3317 and 10455. And my old rig, which was a Dell Precision T34 workstation with a Core 2 Quad Q9300, which had scores of 1682 and 4758. After having some trouble getting it to run at first, the first thing I tried was Portal 2, which ran at a smooth 60 FPS average at 1080p on low settings, only dipping down to 40 during the loading screens, I think? It wasn't really clear. The gameplay was smooth and the controls were very responsive. Next we have Half-Life 2, which will pretty much run on everything in your toaster. Here it ran at a solid 60 FPS, only dipping down to 40 or so during the more action-heavy portions of the game. I tried the Sonic Generations demo, and it ran a little bit choppy, running at about 57 FPS with some hiccups in Classic Sonic Stage, and about 58.5 FPS with slight hiccups in Modern Sonic Stage. Something I noticed when I was trying to play through Modern Green Hill was that some of my button inputs weren't coming through, which was really odd to me. For the three of you that still care, Minecraft runs very smoothly on mid to high settings. It averaged at 59.2 FPS, and it took me a minute to remember that I was still recording gameplay as I was playing, and I just got really immersed into the world for whatever reason. Oops. For the 10 of you that still have raging boners for this game, Fortnite runs super well, averaging about 44.5 frames per second on medium settings. Golf with your friends, because why not? Golf with your friends runs beautifully on low settings at 1080p. It averaged at about 70.8 FPS, which was really nice. The game I was most surprised about running was Wolfenstein: The New Order. I didn't think it would run at all, seeing how this game was released like years after all these parts were, but to my surprise it ran at a decent 45 FPS on low to medium settings. Streaming 1080p 60 FPS video went really well with minimum hiccups, and watching movies and VLC works properly. And that's really all there is to the Not Mac. It's a pretty good machine, especially for what it is. It does have some room for upgrades. For example, I could upgrade the RAM to 8 gigabytes if I really need to, but so far I don't really see a need to. I can also get a better Xeon chip or another standard LJ775 CPU, but for the time being, I'm fine with what it is right now. If you're interested in building one of these by yourself, I'm going to leave a parts list in the description below where you can find the exact parts that I use, and if not the exact ones, then fairly similar ones. One thing I forgot to mention during the video is that the DVD drives are useless. They have no drives inside them, and they're just for aesthetics. I cut out the tray that was supposed to hold the DVD drives in, so there's nothing to hold them, and if I just would use them, they would kind of just fall through, and yeah. So that's the thing. If you're new to this channel and you came here through this video, welcome! Feel free to check out some of my other content. I make videos about gaming history, I throw in a couple pop culture references here and there, social commentary every once in a while. This was just a fun little school project that I decided to talk to you guys about and tell you about, and yeah. If you like this video, feel free to check out some of my other content, but if you didn't, and if this is where we part, thank you so much for watching. Peace.